to the podcast, everybody. Sister Liz here, and you're about to hear the first part in our 4-part series of the Psalms of Lament with Father Patrick Griffin. It's a great series of episodes here during Lent, and we hope you enjoy it. Take a screenshot of this episode or send the link to someone that you know will benefit from this episode. It's an introduction to the Psalms of Lament and Psalm 22 in this episode. Enjoy it, guys.
Hi, everyone. This is Sister Elizabeth, and you are listening to In the Company of Charity, the podcast of the Daughters of Charity, and I'm here with Father Patrick Griffin, a good friend of the podcast. He's coming to us from St. John's University in Queens, New York. As you remember, Father is the executive director of the Vincentian Center for Church and Society at St. John's, and he's spoken with a number of times on Barnabas and St. Joseph specifically, and we enjoyed those tremendously, Father. So we're really happy to have you with us again today. And today we're going to be talking about Psalms of Lament in our preparation for Lent, and understanding how the Psalms are really the songs of the people, the songs of the church, and how they give voice to people's pain and suffering, as well as joy and praise. But today we're going to be talking specifically about Psalms of Lament. So I welcome you, Father, and just let's dive in. I know you wanted to start with Psalm 13. And so if people have their Bibles with them, you might want to go get your Bible to join us in this. That's where we're going to begin. So welcome, Father. And again, thanks for being here with us.
You're welcome. Thank you. And it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to join you, especially when you ask me to do something that I really like doing, which is to say, talking about the scriptures. And let me begin by talking a little bit about the Psalms in general, and then working my way into Psalms of Lament in particular, and then picking up Psalm 13. So I'll try to follow that general plan. Because I'd like to, I've taught most of the scriptures in the different places that I've been in, seminaries and in universities. And so I've taught most of the books of the scripture. But if you ask me, you only can teach one book of the scripture here, then I would pick the Psalms. All right. I really like the Psalms. I like the way in which they invite us to get to know an individual and the particular thing that's going on in his or her life, and the way in which they cry out to the Lord. The thing about the Psalms is that you're invited not to pray simply the prayer of the psalmist, but you're invited to make his or her psalm your psalm. And so there's no such thing as a wrong interpretation of a psalm. It's how was I able to pray using these words of this other individual. And that's really the blessings of the Psalms, that enables one to do that. And I like teaching them because they're so individual. Each of the Psalms I look at as being written by a different person. And the different person has something happening in his or her life, and they just want to share that, and they want to share it before the Lord, and they don't apologize for what they have to say. They just put it out there. When I think of the Psalms, I think of my image of it is as an art gallery. You walk into an art gallery and there's all these rooms around, and the different rooms are for different styles of painting or different eras or that kind of thing. So you go into one and you see all of these different works by certain individual, perhaps, or by a number of individuals who wrote around the same, who painted around the same idea. I see the Psalms that way as well. So you have one room is filled with Psalms of praise and the different ways in which the authors wrote their Psalm of praise hanging on the wall there for you, or law Psalms, or Psalms of the Torah, or Psalms of petition, or Psalms of, as we're going to do today, Psalms of lamentation or wisdom. There's all kinds of different Psalms that one could pay attention to, and they have a particular character, and that's the wonderful thing about them. You can wander into one room, and when you're tired of playing with that or looking at those Psalms, you go to another room, and there's just 150 of them. So there's a huge variety of things that somebody can pay attention to. I like teaching them because I know there's a couple of Psalms which are mainline. You have to deal with these because those are the ones that people are generally familiar with, and you want to explain those. But then there's always the opportunity for me to deal with 3 or 4 Psalms that I haven't dealt with before, and it gives me a chance to leap in and pay attention to them. So the Psalms is really a beautiful prayer form. And if you're going to look at an example of somebody writing a psalm in the New Testament, that's the Magnificat. All right, that's Mary. She looks at her own experience. She's just filled with experience of God present in her life, and she wants to pour it out. And that's what a psalm is. And so, and she does that. When you pray the Psalms, really 2 things are going on there. First of all, there's the content that's in the psalm, what the psalmist wrote about and how important that is. But the second thing is what you bring when you enter into the psalm. What is going on in my life, and how do I see what's going on in my life present within the words of the psalmist. So there's really those 2 dynamics going on, what the psalmist has to say and what I bring. And then the meaning happens between those 2 points. So that's a really wondrous possibility. I think of the Psalms and I say, there's really 3 things that happen with regard to interpretation. The first thing is, what did the psalmist think? What did the psalmist have to say? That's the first thing. And when you do that, you have to be respectful of the Hebrew character of the psalm. So you can't de-Hebrew or take the Jewish character out of the psalm from the very beginning. You have to, first of all, understand what he or she had to say. So that's where I would start. And then the second thing, when you're dealing with the Psalms, you ask yourself, how would Jesus have prayed this psalm? And that's a real question. There's a number of Psalms which are evident in the way in which Jesus speaks and preaches. And you might ask yourself in a broader way, how would Jesus hear this psalm? I mean, the absolutely clear one is the 23rd Psalm, the so-called Shepherd Psalm, and then the way in which Jesus uses those images in his Good Shepherd speaking. And then the third interpretation is yours, okay? What's the psalmist had thought about it, what Jesus might have thought about it, and now what do I think about it? What's the interpretation that I bring to it? And when you bring the 3 of those together, there's really a lot to be learned as one picks up the psalm. And then finally, just let me say this about Psalms in general. The Psalms are not meant so much to describe something, but they're meant to evoke something, all right? It's not, can I get to understand what the situation is of the psalmist, but does the psalmist evoke that experience within me or that feeling within me? Does he touch something really important in me? So they're not descriptions of what's gone on in his life, but it's something that tells you what has been going on in his life and what difference it's made and what emotions, what thoughts, what belief has been evoked in him. And then you hope that those same kind or similar things gets evoked within yourself. So that's something on the Psalms in general, and maybe a little more than I could have done, and not as much as I'd like to do. But that gives you kind of an introduction to the Psalms. We're going to pay attention in particular to the Psalms of Lament, and just a few of those Psalms of Lament today. The Psalms of Lament, as I would describe them, are songs and poems that cry out to God when a person is in deep distress or despair. God's help, God's intervention is sought to deliver the person from whatever's going on, sorrow, suffering, loss, failure, and to rescue the psalmist from his or her enemies if that's part of the problem of the psalmist. We'll see that showing up in one of the Psalms today. So expressions of trust in God to act in our favor in the Psalm leads to the hope and the joy, which is part of it. And when we're talking about the Lament Psalms, there are 65 Psalms that are usually characterized as lament. So you can argue about this one or that one, but there's a lot of Psalms of Lament in our Psalter. So pretty much half of them. Some of them are personal and some of them are communal. So they're the individual praying or the member of the community praying for the particular thing that's going on around them. They're beautiful poems, and that's why they really offer a really nice thing. When you're dealing with the Psalms of Lament, you can usually talk about 4 or 5 parts to the psalm. The first part is the address, the calling out upon God. The second part is the complaint that the psalmist has. The third part is the petition that the psalmist would like to make. And then the fourth part is the affirmation or the resolution. So you can think about the way in which that would show up in our ordinary experience. So if you're dealing with somebody, you say your address might be, "Hey Joe," and then your complaint might be, "You keep parking in my space." And then your petition might be, "Could you not do that?" And then the affirmation, the resolution is, "You're a nice guy. I'm sure we're going to get along fine. Have a good day." So you introduce yourself, you say what the problem is, you offer a solution to the problem, and then you finish up with a kind word. The Psalms of Lament are not dissimilar to that in the way in which they are structured. And we'll see the way in which that plays out in the first psalm that I'd like to consider with you, which is Psalm 13. Psalm 13 is the shortest psalm of lament in the Psalter. It's an individual psalm. If you look at it, and I could go through this with you, you'll see how often the psalmist is always talking about me and I and my. So it captures that. It's her particular difficulty, which she's bringing before the Lord. So let's just take a quick look at the whole psalm and then go back and pick up some of the ideas on it. So it begins, "How long, Lord, will you utterly forget me? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I carry sorrow in my soul, grief in my heart day after day? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look upon me. Answer me, Lord, my God. Give light to my eyes, lest I sleep in death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed. Lest my foes rejoice at my downfall. But I trust in your mercy. Grant my heart joy in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has dealt bountifully with me." So there it is, the whole psalm. It's rather short, but it has a lot to say about the way in which God's absence is experienced and the way in which the psalmist wants to call upon God, and particularly the way in which the psalmist is probably dealing with the issue of death. Okay, we'll talk about how that might be discerned in the psalm, but it might be other issues as well. So if we then back and began to look at the psalm and the different parts in which it's supposed to have within it. So beginning with the address, okay? So the way in which the Lord is addressed is, "How long, Lord?" Okay? It uses the divine name for the Lord. That's the Hebrew personal name of God, which is written there, Lord. In lots of our Bibles, that's going to be written capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That means it's the holy name of God, not just an ordinary use of the word Lord. And so that's the way in which the psalmist is addressing the Lord in this particular psalm. The name itself means the one who is present, okay? So that gives a certain weight to the way in which one reads the psalm. The psalmist is talking to the one who is present in the midst of some experience of absence. So that's the address. Then the complaint. "How long, Lord, will you utterly forget me? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I carry sorrow in my soul, grief in my heart day after day? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" Okay, that's the complaint. The psalmist is experiencing the absence of God. He's experienced the way in which that absence brings sorrow into his soul. He's experienced the way in which his enemies are rejoicing at his particular difficulty. So that first part then puts the complaint out there. How long, Lord, before I experience you present in my life? That's the complaint. And you notice in it again, as I said before, all of the personal words. Forget me, from me, my soul, my heart, my enemy. The psalmist is praying out of his or her own situation. So the address, Lord. The complaint, how long are you going to ignore me? How long are you going to be absent from me in my experience? Then the petition, look upon me. Answer me, my God. Give light to my eyes, lest I sleep in death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed. Lest my foes rejoice at my downfall. Again, all the personal pronouns, all right? Me, upon me, answer me, my God, my eyes, I sleep, my enemy, my foes, my downfall. There's no doubt but that in this psalm, the psalmist is talking about stuff that's going on in his or her life and coming before the Lord with that particular issue. So that first verse here in the petitions calls upon God to answer. Look upon me, answer me, Lord my God. And what's he asking the Lord? Give light to my eyes, lest I sleep in death. All right. So there's something about the fear of death or dying or something that's going on in the psalmist that's causing him or her to be uneasy. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed, lest my foes rejoice at my downfall. The enemy here, the singular, is oftentimes presumed to be death itself, okay? And the foes are the contenders, the enemies of David, who would be, if you're taking David as the author of the psalm, who would rejoice over the death of the psalmist. So the petition is out there. Look, answer me, give light to my eyes, lest I sleep in death. You know that in the Hebrew way of thinking, death wasn't something that just happened all at once. You die gradually, okay? And we experience it that too. As we grow older, we begin to lose our hearing. Our hearing isn't as good. We don't see as well as we used to do. We don't smell. We can't move around as quickly as we used to do. So little by little, we give up all of those things which were so powerfully a part of our life at an earlier stage. And then finally, we die, all right? All of the elements of our life, of our person, are gone. So they would think about somebody dying gradually, which is why it's interesting when you take Jesus and Jesus gives healing throughout the whole course of Jesus's life. It's not just healing the ears or healing the eyes or allowing a person to walk around. He's giving life back to the person, okay? So the psalmist pleads for the Lord to give light to his eyes. And that's the same as help me to live more fully. Help me to continue with this life. Then the affirmation, verse 6. But I trust in your mercy. Grant my heart joy in your salvation, right? Affirming what he wants the Lord to do and have confidence that the Lord will do it. And again, but I trust, all right? My heart has joy in your salvation. So the psalmist is affirming his belief. Now, the thing about Psalms of Lament is not that the psalmist is totally lamenting his or her situation. They begin what the problem is, the complaint. Then they say the way in which they hope the Lord is going to resolve that for them. Then they talk about the way in which they're confident that the Lord is going to act in their lives. And that's the affirmation here in verse 6. And then the resolution, all right, the final expression of one's confidence in the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has dealt bountifully with me, all right? So where it begins, so how long? It ends with the psalmist's great confidence that he knows that the Lord is going to act positively in his life. So that's a real quick look at a short Psalm of Lament, but you can see the way in which it develops, all right? The lament is the complaint, and then the way in which the psalmist is asking the Lord to act, or at the petition, and then the confidence of the psalmist with an affirmation, and then saying goodbye to the Lord at the end. That's an ordinary way for a Psalm of Lament to develop.
I just can't tell you how much I appreciate that whole explanation of just the Psalms themselves, but using this one psalm to go through that process is really, really helpful. And I'm just kind of sitting thinking, so we're kind of wandering in the art gallery, we're in the hall of lament, and before us are these paintings, described in words. I loved, you were saying it's not a description of an event, but it is something to evoke emotion or to even evoke God, to kind of wake him up and say, what's going on, especially in these, what's happening here?
The
So I
same thing
really,
happens with art, right?
exactly.
It's not just looking at it, it's feeling what the thing has to say.
Yeah. And as you said, there may be the artist's interpretation from their own personal, as they were evoked to do this, but it's also creating, like poetry. These are poetry. Poetry evokes in us an emotion that may or may not even have been the artist's intent in some way because of our own experience. I think the other is as you were saying, this is a personal psalm. Some others we know will speak about Israel, and the psalm may not be just about a person, but a people. That it just reminds me that in the Psalms, at least as I've experienced them, and maybe in this sense, that the Lord, as he's called upon in the Psalms, has kind of a personal relationship with the psalmist. There's also a social relationship in these, because we'll see in others where someone is being attacked by his enemies or his friends, or there's a social aspect and the Lord is in the mix of that. Even though it's not an event, there's a history around the struggles of the people of Israel. Again, I think that sense of the art gallery image was so helpful. So I really, really appreciate that, because I can just feel, that as our listeners and myself, that as I wander through the Psalms, I'll be more attentive to say, well, so what's happening in this one? What's being evoked in me? What room am I in? What does the art around me look like? So I really, really appreciate that. When I first read this one, and as you were reading it, I think what evoked for me was the heavy, heavy weight of the beginning. And sometimes it's hard to say, how did we get from how long, like the suffering feels so weighty, to I will sing to the Lord.
Right.
Because the answer, as you were saying, the complaint and then the petition, this is what I need you to do. Bring light to my eyes. And all of this burden will disappear. It's so profound, really, that the psalmist has this powerful sense of what God can do, what the Lord can do. And in your reference to Jesus bringing life, I hadn't even thought about that. Like, he is the psalm in some ways. He's the one we cry to, and he brings us new life. So I just really appreciated that, and just that image again of the crying out to God and God's answering, or at least asking, and then trusting God will answer. Really, there's no clear resolution.
No.
There's no like, okay, you did this. Although in some psalms I think that happens, but in this one, I just trust. I trust that you're gonna answer. You're gonna hear me and answer my prayer. So I appreciate that a lot.
Welcome. I
So
think it's good that way. And it enables the reader to the prayer to begin to apply it in his or her life in whatever way that they want to. I remember when I had church history, not church history, art history in college, which is a long time ago. One of the things that I remember the professor saying was that after the artist has painted a picture, he loses control of it. It's no longer his. So what he wanted to do, or what he wanted to show her, that he doesn't control that. She doesn't control that anymore. Now it's the viewer, right? It's the one who looks at it. What does it mean to me? What do I see in it? That kind of thing. And the psalm is like that. It's not just what was the experience of the psalmist, and I got to figure that out. You don't have to figure that out. What you have to decide is, how does this mean something in my life? Because we can imagine people saying all the time, how long is this going to be going on? How long am I going to have to deal? That's the experience of all of us, but we put a different experience that causes us to ask that really important question. But when the bottom line is that you still have confidence in the Lord, but even having confidence in the Lord, you're not afraid to ask the question. That's the value. That's the strength of these kinds of prayers.
yeah, and not afraid to come to the Lord to say how much you're suffering, and that he can do something about this.
Yeah.
He can stop this. Yeah. So where would you like to go next? What's the next Psalm of Lament that we could take a look at together and see how?
Well, there's a lot of psalms that I really like, and there's a number of laments that are really powerful for me. But maybe one that would be useful is just to move to Psalm 22, because it's one that we have some familiarity with, at least at the beginning. So Psalm 22. Psalm 22 has that first verse, which is very familiar to us. Okay. Why is it familiar to us? Because it's the last words that Jesus spoke in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's important to know that when Jesus speaks those words at the very end of his life, because he dies in Matthew and Mark's Gospel immediately after having spoken these words, why is it important that we know that this is Psalm 22 and that Jesus isn't just saying something and dying? What he's beginning to do is to pray the psalm. And praying the psalm need not have one going through the whole psalm. All I want us to do is begin it. And then that suggests the attitude which is found in the rest of the psalm. And we would know that same kind of thing. Like, you're talking to one of your friends and you talk about one of those songs that you both know, and you don't have to sing the whole song. All you have to do is say, remember in this song, and then the other person says, oh yeah, and then the whole thing comes to mind. The fact that Jesus selected that psalm to end his life in Matthew and Mark's Gospel is really important. So what does it have to say? But the other thing that's important about it, again, is remembering that the Psalms of Lament, they might begin, and they do begin, with a complaint and the problem, but that's not where they end. They end with the confidence in the one who is God. So Jesus's last words are not desperation and surrender, but they're words which we begin with the experience that he has, and then leads one to the confidence that the psalmist ends this psalm with. So it's wonderful that way. Also, you'll see in Psalm 22 lots of the description that the New Testament authors use for describing the death of Jesus. Okay, I'll try to point out some of those to you. So it's not a psalm that's unknown, obviously, to the New Testament community, but they actually use them in the way in which they describe what happens to Jesus in his being killed. So let's take a quick look at the psalm. And there's lots of ways of going through this, but let me do it that way. So we begin with the address. My God, why have you abandoned me? All right. That's the way in which the psalmist calls upon the divine. And then, the sense of being abandoned, you can imagine how appropriate this might be in the experience of Jesus. My problem here is that I could begin by just trying to stick with the experience of the psalmist, or also try to bring the experience of Jesus into the discussion at the same time. Usually, if I was teaching, I'd say, we're only going to deal with the psalmist, and then we're going to deal with Jesus. But maybe for the interest of time, I maybe get some particular focus on this with regard to Jesus. It's worthwhile to talk a little bit about both. My God, why have you abandoned me? The experience of Jesus throughout the course of his life is he experienced the effects of sin. He didn't sin himself, but he experienced the effects of sin. So he knew what it was to hear lies, and he knew what it was to have violence, and he knew what a lack of generosity was like. Those are all the effects of sin. Jesus experienced that. He knew what those kinds of things were. He knew what it was to be hungry or thirsty. All those kinds of things which are the effects of sin to a certain extent, of human weakness in a person's life. But all of those effects of sin means that God is distant. Okay, that's the very nature of sin, pushing God to a distance. And so at the very end of his life, when everything is taken away from him, his clothing, or everything, his dignity, and stripped naked, and they're finally taking his life. My God, why have you abandoned me? So it's that experience, that final experience of sin, which is death. Okay. So Jesus comes to know that at the very end of his life, not sinning himself, but knowing what the effects of sin is. So that's what brings this psalm to mind for him. That's his experience. My God, why have you abandoned me? And then it continues into the complaint. Why so far from my call for help, from my cries of anguish? My God, I call by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I have no relief. Right? The psalmist has experienced this constant abandonment, or this constant sense of God not being present to him. Yet You are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the glory of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you rescued them. To you they cried and they escaped. In you they trusted and they were not disappointed. Okay, then as it begins here in this next part where some of the images for the Passion of Jesus are taken. But I am a worm, not a man, scorned by men, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They curl their lips and jeer. They shake their heads at me. He relied on the Lord. Let him deliver him if he loves him. Let him rescue him. Those are all images from the crucifixion of Jesus, all right, the way in which he is mocked and the way in which people says, well, he believed in God and he thought God was going to take care of him. Let God take care of him now. That's taken from the Psalm, all right? Not that it wasn't the experience of Jesus, but the experience of Jesus is captured in the way in which the psalmist tells us, Psalm 22. For you drew me forth from the womb, made me safe at my mother's breasts. Upon you I was thrust from the womb. Since my mother bore me, you are my God. And again, when you think about this in terms of Jesus and the experience of Mary, it's just some wonderful images that can come to mind. Do not stay far from me, for trouble is near and there is no one to help. Many bulls surround me, fierce bulls of Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths against me, lions that rend and roar. So the psalmist continually talking about the way in which he's experienced difficulties. Like water, my life drains away. All my bones are disjointed. My heart has become like wax. It melts away within me. So the Psalm's continually talking about the way in which he's feeling the sense of abandonment. And then the next part, again, deals with the experience of Jesus and the telling of the Passion. As dry as a potsherd on my throat, my tongue cleaves to my palate. You remember Jesus is asking for water because he thirsted from the cross. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of evildoers closes in on me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I mean, what could be more clearly crucifixion than those words? I can count all my bones. They stare at me and gloat. And we know how that was going on. Then this verse 19, they divide my garments among them. For my clothing, they cast lots. I mean, really, that's the soldiers with the garments of Jesus. But you, O Lord, do not stay far off. This is the petition. My strength, come quickly to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the grip of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, my poor life from the horns of wild bulls. Then I will proclaim your name to my brethren. In the assembly, I will praise you. And then, it goes on from there.
I think one of the things as you were reading this, as we were looking at Psalm 113 as well, one of the other aspects that I realize in this is that the psalmist often speaks about the people who are seeing their distress, their dismay, their abandonment, and saying, help me, because by helping me, you prove who you are, Lord. Like part of the abandonment is not just how I'm personally suffering. That's bad enough, but it's also the disdain of those who are watching my suffering or who are causing my suffering, that they believe there is no hope. My healing, giving me new life is not just a gift to me because I somehow earn it, deserve it, or something, but it is a witness to your power. It just hadn't struck me as much as you were reading this. The other was the same. They're looking at me, I'm disdainful in their eyes. But not only will I be healed, but the people could be healed. They will see as well your power and can come to you. Yeah, I just found that kind of striking in this, that's an element as well in some of these lamentation psalms, is how others see my distress as a sign of God's abandoning me. And so show them that you haven't abandoned me. And then I will sing your praises.
Amen. the absence of God is a regular element in the laments. It shows up, even if that's not the primary purpose of that individual psalm. There's in it somewhere or other the sense that God has not been present in this situation as much as God could. And it invites the psalmist to express his or her faith. Okay, I've experienced this, and these bad things are going on, but I still believe. All right, I still trust that the Lord God is going to answer me and is going to work in my life. So I mean, they're wonderful in that regard. It doesn't begin with what's going to be the end, the praise of God. It begins with the difficulty, but that's the place, that's the direction in which the psalmist is heading. That nonetheless, despite all of this stuff that's going on, and I can't deny the stuff that's going on, I do believe that the Lord God is going to act on my behalf. And that's why Psalm 22 makes sense from the cross as Jesus' last words in Matthew and Mark's gospel. You see, as the psalm begins to work towards the end, it says, "You who fear the Lord give praise." This is verse 24. "All descendants of Jacob give honor. Show reverence, all descendants of Israel," calling the people to reverence the Lord. "For he has not spurned or disdained the misery of this poor wretch." Right? You can imagine Jesus calling himself a poor wretch. "I will offer praise in the great assembly." That's verse 26. Verse 28. "All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of nations will bow low before him." So it moves towards the praise of God at the end of the psalm. It's a wonderful psalm, and in our context, in the Christian context, it really has great meaning.
Yeah, I just was looking at verse 31 and 32, the very, very end. And I think this is, again, hadn't really, you read these and then it's not until you sit with someone else and read it and say, what is it really trying to say? At the end, he says, "And I will live for the Lord, my descendants will serve you." And I think, well, that's us. We are the descendants to serve him. "The generation to come will be told of the Lord, but they may proclaim to a people yet unborn the deliverance you have brought." That's just very powerful. When you think about us reading it, that they will proclaim to a people who aren't even born yet. And so here we are, and we can still read this and have a sense of it as contemporary, right? Understanding it as a song of Jesus, which of course wasn't happening at the time it was written, right? But we can see how the Lord has taken the abandonment, the suffering, the sense that people suffer, as you said, the effects of sin, and through Jesus gives us that life back, as you mentioned earlier, that restoration of life that is being taken away day by day in our suffering, especially because of the effects of sin. And what part of life, what part of history hasn't seen the effects of sin? None. And so we continue to read this, and yet at the end we can still say, generations will come and be told of you, and they will proclaim to a people yet unborn, which is our own evangelization, is to continue to say Jesus was not abandoned on the cross. You were not abandoned in your suffering. That the Lord is there to help lift us. If we cry out to him, tell him what you need. I mean, it's so classic. I teach a child to pray this way. And then when we get older, we kind of get lost in our own suffering and pain and forget that the Lord has been faithful for generations upon generations.
Thanks so much for listening, friends. Stay tuned next week for part 2 of the Psalms of Lament with Father Patrick Griffin, and he'll be dealing with Psalm 88. Thanks so much.